Hello and welcome to the LLG Grapevine podcast. You're listening to Helen McGrath, Head of Public Affairs, and Dennis Hall, LLG Bulletin Editor.
Hi everyone.
Back together once again, Dennis, after what has been another turbulent period in our national politics. I can't even remember who the Prime Minister was when we last did the podcast together. Let's bring some stability to all of this. What have you got for us first?
Thanks, Helen. But before I begin, just a reminder. Do you know, many records are being broken concerning British government. We've just had 3 Prime Ministers in 3 months, 4 Chancellors in 4 months, 3 Home Secretaries in less than 2 months. All bound to come up in a pub quiz. Now, back to our sector. And standards are in the news yet again. Here's the story. The Committee on Standards in Public Life has called on the government to reconsider its position on the powers of local authorities to sanction councillors for poor behaviour. In March this year, the government rejected a recommendation by the Standards Watchdog in its 2019 Local Government Ethical Standards report that local authorities should be able to suspend councillors without allowances for up to 6 months for breaches of the Code of Conduct. The report had also recommended that councillors be given the right to appeal to the local government and social care ombudsman if their local authority imposed a period of suspension. The ombudsman would have been given the power to investigate the allegation and impose a binding decision on the council. However, in its formal response, the government said there is no provision in current legislation for a sanction to suspend a councillor found to have breached the Code of Conduct. And this was a deliberate policy decision by the coalition government at the time of the Localism Act 2011 to differentiate from the previous failed Standards Board regime. Now, in a letter to Levelling Up Secretary Simon Clarke, the committee chair, Lord Evans, said, "While we note the government's commitment to further work to support local government, the committee is very disappointed that many of its careful recommendations have not been accepted. It was clear from our evidence," he said, "that the sector backed our call to strengthen the arrangements in place to support high ethical standards. There is clear frustration within local authorities at the limited powers within the local government standards regime to address poor behaviour by a minority of individuals." Lord Evans urged the Secretary of State to reconsider the committee's recommendations, adding that it would welcome a conversation with Mr. Clarke. He added, "Across all tiers of local government, decisions are taken about a wide range of local services using public funds, so it is important that there are robust governance arrangements that command public confidence." We agree. The government's response on this is not the end of the matter. Changes to the standards regime remains unfinished business. And of course, with last week's ministerial changes, the ball is now very much in Michael Gove's court.
Well, it will be interesting to see what Gove's response to this is, but we also have the long-awaited response to virtual meeting provision, which seems to be gaining leverage in relation to levelling up and the planning process at least. And there's also the actual commitment from government to provide statutory protections for chief officers that we are of course, very keen to be introduced into law. Now, the ban on fracking in England has been reinstated by Rishi Sunak, reversing the decision, of course, of Liz Truss, who lifted the ban during her tenure. But the new Prime Minister faces a number of thorny issues with immediate concern, the retained EU law revocation and reform bill being amongst them. The Commons research briefing on the bill states, "It is difficult to assess the impact this bill will have on the substantive law of the UK. If it is enacted and nothing is done legislatively thereafter, vast reams of retained EU law will fall away at the end of 2023. This would create precisely the gaps in domestic law the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018 was designed to avoid." Joshua Rosenberg blogs that this is unlikely as matters will be addressed all the way up to the sunset clause, but how they will be used is his question. The second reading of the Commons debate took place on the 22nd of October. There was much concern raised about erosion of employment rights, including the impact on women in the workplace. There were claims on the potential erosion of environmental protections, and an admittance that the list of laws covered by the bill were not comprehensive. Conservative member Graham Stewart, however, urged opposition members to recognise that the bill was a, quote, framework bill, which was not going to deliver any of the negative outcomes the opposition had been predicting. As usual, we will wait and see. Now, Dennis, I see your attention is turning to election reform and the latest parliamentary report. What's the news?
Well, again, just before that, Helen, here's another pub quiz fact. At just 42, Rishi Sunak is the youngest Prime Minister since Lord Liverpool, who took office in 1812. Now, back to elections. This is the latest report on election regulation. Here's the detail. Complex and confusing electoral law is impacting the Electoral Commission's ability to oversee elections, and the watchdog may struggle to provide timely guidance on the new voter ID rules. This is according to warnings from the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee of the House of Commons. In a report focused on the work of the independent regulator, the committee said that challenges lie ahead for the Electoral Commission in supporting electoral administrators in understanding and navigating the changes ahead of local elections in May 2023, when voters will be required to produce ID at the polls to vote. The committee criticised the government's electoral reforms set out in the Election Act 2022, claiming that it missed the opportunity to build an election framework fit for the modern era. The bill includes a number of electoral reforms, including rules requiring voter ID and changes to government oversight of the Electoral Commission. According to the committee, the government's timeline for implementing new rules on voter ID is flawed, as its plan to implement the statutory instrument for voter ID requirements does not leave enough time for the Electoral Commission to finalise its guidance before elections in May 2023. In addition, the committee said the new voter ID rules add to the levels of divergence across the UK on electoral policy, as they only apply to UK-wide general elections. The rules will not apply to elections to the devolved legislatures on local elections in Scotland and Wales. Under the 2022 Act, the government plans to set the strategic direction of the Electoral Commission through the issuance of a strategy and policy statement. The committee noted, however, that this new power significantly alters the Electoral Commission's relationship to government as an independent body. But it welcomed the consultation period for the policy statement, adding that it will continue to take an active interest in this area of constitutional significance. Chair of the Parliamentary Committee, William Wragg MP, said, "The UK's outdated and complicated body of electoral law is the fundamental challenge facing the Electoral Commission in delivering its crucial services. We are concerned," he said, "by the amount the government and the Electoral Commission will have to deliver by the elections in May 2023 and the impact on voters and campaigners." He added, "The government has so far failed to act on repeated calls to simplify the law, but the fairness of our electoral processes is too important to neglect any longer. It must now grasp the nettle of reform and future-proof the regulation of elections. We need greater scrutiny of online campaigning," he said, "a more proportionate approach to those accused of breaking the rules, and better protections against foreign influence in our elections."
Well, I know the Association of Electoral Administrators are working hard to address such issues, and LLG greatly value the collaboration we enjoy with that important organisation. Now, taken from the LGA Bulletin, last Tuesday, the Social Housing Regulation Bill completed its report stage in the House of Lords. Peers passed a range of amendments, including ones which will make it a requirement for social housing providers' staff to meet new professional competency standards and require the regulator of social housing to specify how often it inspects the conditions of social landlords' properties. The LGA has called on the government to ensure a proportionate risk-based approach to inspection and urgently clarify how this will be delivered and funded. Elsewhere, Politics East reports that hundreds more homeless households across England are being rehoused miles from their jobs and schools, according to figures from Freedom of Information requests. More than 6,000 households were moved more than 20 miles from their local neighbourhood in out-of-area placements by 53 councils in the last 4 years. The housing crisis is surely going to get increasingly worse, directly affected as it is by the cost of living crisis. A lack of available accommodation, a lack of funding, and a system under pressure leaves me no room for more cheerful positivity, I'm afraid. Let's move on. Dennis, hybrid meetings are increasingly commonplace. What's the latest on that?
Well, again, just before I cover that, did you know that Liz Truss held office for just 44 days? She surpasses the record for the shortest premiership, which was previously held by George Canning, who held office for 119 days in 1827, but he died in office. Yes, now, back to my final item. The Law Society held its AGM as a hybrid meeting, and this has generated a number of interesting observations. Here's the story. The Law Society's annual general meeting took place last week. It was an opportunity for members to ask office holders questions arising out of the annual reports, accounts, and other matters. Despite all pandemic restrictions being lifted for many months now, the meeting was held in hybrid format. Most were in the room, but some were on the screen. Columnist Jonathan Goldsmith observes that our ways of participating and interconnecting have changed forever. He said, yet there appears to be a mini trend against participation in person for training and certain other events. In-person training, for example, is less well attended than before the pandemic. Lawyers seemingly don't want to leave their homes or offices for training when it is available on demand without moving. But Goldsmith says the reasons to attend in person are important, indeed profound. It is usually much better for our mental health, for our well-being, for our networking opportunities, and for information gathering. He points also to the American Bar Association, which has just published an interesting survey of nearly 2,000 lawyers called "Where Does the Legal Profession Go Now?" One of the key questions asked was what patterns of hybrid work are taking place and what workplace policies are preferred by lawyers. 87% of respondents were allowed to work remotely, 30% worked wholly from home, and 63% had the ability to choose their own schedule. But the report revealed some negatives. For instance, women lawyers and lawyers of colour were much more concerned than their counterparts about the possible negative consequences of remote working, such as missing business opportunities, being overlooked for meaningful assignments, receiving lower pay or reviews, and not being seen as committed. In other words, all the disadvantages you associate with being less visible. But finally, and on a lighter note, there was a finding in the report with which Goldsmith said he can identify with as someone who works from home. When asked what kinds of technology lawyers need in order to feel well supported at work, the usual answers, as expected, included strong IT support, office quality internet access, and so on. But there was one which caught his eye. Many want home equipment that parallels the office equipment that they once had. And in particular, they missed having access to an office quality printer. I quite agree.
Finally, from me, the government announced a press release last week entitled "Government Backs New Law to Help Pregnant Women and New Parents Stay in Work," in which it proposes to give pregnant women and new parents greater protections from redundancy under new legislation. Under current rules, before offering redundancy to an employee on maternity leave, shared parental leave, or adoption leave, employers have an obligation to offer them a suitable alternative vacancy where one exists. The Pregnancy and Maternity Discrimination Bill, introduced by Dan Jarvis MP and backed by the government, will enable this redundancy protection to be extended, so it applies to pregnant women as well as new parents returning to work from a relevant form of leave. This will help shield new parents and expected mothers from workplace discrimination, offering them greater job security at an important time in their lives. Now, it follows a government consultation on these proposals, which found evidence of new parents facing prejudice in the workplace, with an estimated 54,000 women a year feeling they have to leave their jobs due to pregnancy or maternity discrimination. I can certainly attest to knowing women who themselves have been affected by this, and for a private member's bill, it's done very well to get this far. entitled the Protection from Redundancy, Pregnancy and Family Leave Bill, it's passed its second reading in Parliament and is on course to proceed. And a reminder, lastly, that you can still book for the LLG Governance Conference in Birmingham on the 11th of November, where I can guarantee that aside from the expected training, networking and social enjoyments, you will be entertained by some incredibly talented, or at the very least, highly amusing members of your own profession. You really won't want to miss it. So that's it for another edition of the podcast. You can read more on the items discussed today and many more besides by going to bulletin number 39, available now on the LLG website. So it's goodbye from me.
And from me too.
Thank you for listening. Have a good week.